accidentally hit the go live button before he could. So we're just going to do, this is the beginning of the episode.
So all I was going to ask is like what exactly you wanted to go over today, because we talked about going over David Liu's article, and maybe that's one thing we want to talk about. But I was looking at the the description that you gave on YouTube, and you mentioned my like recent yes article, and so I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that one as well, or just the reply I wrote to David Liu, or like where we want to.
Well, I don't mind really. So I wanted to just try and cover most of the arguments for the causal premise. If you think it's worth going over this for a full session, we can do that. If you want to squeeze in two things, that's also fine. I mean,
those two articles are very closely related. So I think we could talk about the stuff about David Liu, and then talk about the other article as it up in relationship to my response to Liu's article.
Cool. Okay, good. So, sorry, just answering a question in the chat. The Japanese philosopher I was talking about last time round was Nishida Kitaro. So that is a good shout by Shassit79, knowing who that was, frankly. So, well, fair play. Yeah, okay, cool. So, this is Kalam Prep Week 2, I guess, should sort of intro video. Still going through the causal premise, still just working my way slowly from like base camp 1 has been done. So I think, Dan, that you're one of the, you must be really one of the world's leading people on this exact topic that we're going to talk about right now, because, right, it's the causal premise, and your PhD was it not actually on the causal premise?
I didn't write anything in my dissertation on the causal premise.
Did you not?
Yeah, I have several papers after my PhD that are on the causal premise. The way that I think about this, something like this, is that in philosophy of religion, people take it for granted that if something begins to exist, and the kind of explanation that it has to have is a causal explanation. And so the people that are promoting the causal principle think that the alternative to the causal principle would be giving up in any kind of explanation for why things begin to exist. And then you'd have worries that are related to the principle sufficient reason, right? In other words, they think that since the only alternative they think to the causal principle is that things would begin without explanations, that means that there would be no sufficient reason at all whenever things begin to exist. In contrast, if you look at other branches of philosophy, if you look at, for example, philosophy of physics and some related parts of metaphysics, there's a long-standing literature according to which there are non-causal explanations. So in the philosophy of physics literature, you can trace this importantly back. There's a really important paper by Bertrand Russell called On the Nature of Cause from 1912. But in fact, Russell is sort of cribbing ideas that came before him that were really popular in 19th century philosophy, what was sometimes back then called scientific philosophy, what we would now be tempted to call philosophy of physics. And people like Ernst Mach denied that efficient causation is the right way, the right category of explanation from which to draw upon to give explanations in the sciences. Russell agrees with that, and there's now a long-standing tradition of people that are called neo-Russellians. But in addition to the neo-Russellians, if you look at, as I was saying, some related parts of metaphysics, some stuff, for example, that comes up in philosophy of mathematics, there's people that think that there are, for example, mathematical explanations, and mathematical explanations they think would be non-causal explanations. And they happen to think that some of those examples of non-causal mathematical explanation appear in the physical sciences. So on the one hand, you have a whole bunch of philosophers from various different places saying that you can explain things beginning to exist without invoking causation, and then you have this niche literature in philosophy of religion, where the underlying assumption seems to be that if without a causal explanation, there would be no explanation at all for things beginning to exist.
And this principle, well, is it fair to say that you told me you think it goes back to at least Hobbes, right? That if
So
something began without a cause, then anything could begin without a cause.
So I think in the early modern period, they sometimes use the word cause when what they mean is something like sufficient reason. So you'll sometimes see like early modern philosophers say something like, oh, well, God contains within God's own nature the cause of God's existence. And what they mean is that God is an essentially existent being, right? So, but that's the use of the word causation that's different from the way the philosophers use the word cause now. So there was this broader context in which people were talking about causation, in which maybe cause really did just mean sufficient reason. But there is this argument that you can find in people like Hobbes that comes out of this early modern discussion about free will, according to which if things could begin without a cause, then just anything could begin to exist. I think part of what Hobbes is thinking about is this way of thinking about possibility that we wouldn't endorse now. So Hobbes has in mind, I think, cases like Buridan's ass. So for people who don't know, Buridan's ass is this case where you've got a donkey or an ass that's equidistant between two bales of hay. There's supposed to be just as much reason for the donkey to choose one bale of hay as to choose the other. And then if the donkey has a particular kind of free will, called libertarian free will, the donkey will simply spontaneously choose one bale of hay as opposed to the other, even though there's no additional reason that persuades the donkey to choose one bale of hay as opposed to the other. Hobbes, when thinking about cases like that, thinks that that would involve a kind of contradiction, because he thinks that what would happen is that the donkey would actually choose both. So Hobbes and some other people in the early modern period have this thought that if there's just as much reason for two possible things to be true, then both of those things would be true. And today, when we think about modality, we don't think in those terms. Today we think that if two things are possible, then that means you have two possible worlds. One possible world where it happens one way, and another possible world where it happens the other way. What you don't have is a possible world where that happens both ways. And so some of the early moderns that pick up this kind of concern think that there's literally a contradiction here, that if something could happen multiple ways, it would happen all of those ways. There's a better way of putting the concern that is more consistent with how we think about modality now, and it's the way that Arthur Pryor kind of modifies the concern that you thought of people like Hobbes and Edwards and so on. So what Pryor says is that he puts in terms of explanation that if things could begin without causes, then nothing would explain why completely arbitrary entities don't begin at arbitrary places, in arbitrary numbers, of arbitrary kind, in an arbitrary, did I say times and places? Well, times and places there too. Right, and so this is where, so now when we turn to the philosophy of religion literature, people are interested in defending the causal principle using this sort of idea. And so this is where William Lane Craig picks this up from, he says that he gets it from both Jonathan Edwards and from Pryor. Pryor writes this influential article about Edwards, even though you can in some sense find a similar concern in, as I was saying, Hobbes and Hume as well. And the way that Craig ends up putting this is, well, if things could begin without causes, then there'd be nothing that would explain why like Eskimo villages and raging tigers don't just pop into existence out of the void.
And root beer and Beethoven and bicycles. Yeah.
Yeah, and Andrew Loke also picks up this kind of argument, putting a little bit different. Right? I mean, he has this modus tollens argument, um, and it's in some sense a return to this early modern way of thinking about modality, where he seems to think that where the way his modus tollens argument goes is that if things could begin without causes, then there would be things beginning all over the place without causes,
Yeah.
which is something more like what um, like Hobbes and Edwards and so on had in mind, which I think, if you compare those two, I think then Craig has the better version of the argument.
Only in the sense that, like, Craig's saying, if something could begin with no cause, then other things could begin with no
That's
cause.
right.
And
That's
Loke
right.
is sort of amping up the modality for some reason and saying that they in fact would do.
Yeah.
Okay, look, I can see in the chat that people are saying you're a bit quiet, so I don't know if there's some way that you can get closer to your microphone or something.
I can try. I can also see if I can adjust the here. So I can see if I can adjust the microphone settings on my computer. Microphone setup.
Yeah, I was thinking that Loke's modus tollens argument would be a separate session, but I mean they're so closely related, these bits. Like, it just seems I think Loke's modification of saying would instead of could doesn't like justify it being a different argument. It's like it's really a tweaking. It is different, I guess, if the modality is different, but it's not substantially different that it's a different argument. It's like riffing on the same theme or something.
Yeah, I think that's. By the way, is my microphone better now? I turned up the volume for the input volume.
You sound a lot louder for me, so I'm
Okay.
assuming that's good for everyone else too. But let us know in the chat if that sounds good. My sound should sound quality because I've spent all this money on this microphone, which is like massive. It's bigger than my head, and I've got quite a big head. So if that's not good, then
Yeah, I should see if I can get my department to buy me a big microphone.
Yeah.
The office that I had came with a webcam for whatever reason. So,
well, for teaching reasons, presumably.
I think whoever had this office before, and I don't know who it was, left a bunch of things in here because they also left a clock that doesn't work properly. And every single time someone comes in my office, they look up at the clock. I can't see it from where I'm at my computer because I have to look up to look at it. But when they come into my office, they see it. And so everyone's always telling me that my clock is set incorrectly.
All right. Okay.
But anyway, so yes, I think the only difference between Craig's argument and Loke's is in terms of the modality involved. And then I think it's better to put it in the way that Craig does because the modal claim is not quite as preposterous. Even though, as I was saying, it leaves out this ginormous literature that appears elsewhere in philosophy and doesn't at all consider what that literature might have to say about the causal principle. And doesn't even, so there's also something strange about the way that Craig picks up Arthur Pryor. So in Pryor's article, he points out that there's a difference between a substance beginning to exist versus a substance coming to have a different property. So he thinks that, so in the early modern period, one of the reasons people were interested in this in conjunction with free will is that people thought that if you were the donkey that just chose the bale of hay, then this would involve your coming to have what they call a volition to choose one bale of hay over the other, and this volition is supposed to be uncaused, according to Edwards and Hobbes. And so what Pryor says is that even if it were, there's a difference between the idea that substances could begin without causes versus thinking that a substance could come to have a change of its properties without a cause. And if you have the latter, that a substance could have a change of its properties without a cause, well, then the nature of the substance would constrain what kinds of changes it could undergo.
Right.
And so, in the way that we think about fundamental physics nowadays is that our best theory of fundamental physics, at least the one that's best established, is quantum field theory, and then particles are supposed to supervene on field properties. They're supposed to be explained in terms of these fields. And so you might think that when a particle begins to exist, it's really just the field coming to have some new set of properties. And so if Prior is right, that a substance could change its properties, but this would be constrained by the nature of the substance, then what sorts of changes a field can undergo would be constrained by the nature of the field, that is to say, by the laws of physics. And so if you follow Prior's line, it seems like you wouldn't, after all, get like Eskimos popping into existence out of the void. And this is even if you don't follow the Neo-Russellian line, right? So on this line, the idea is that maybe fields can undergo like spontaneous, uncaused, indeterministic changes or something like that. If you allow for something like that, then they're still constrained by the nature of the fields, what sorts of alterations they could undergo. Right, and this is going to be another difference between not only Prior and Craig, but also Prior and Loke. Loke famously has this, or I don't know, infamously has this argument where he says that a region of electric field could like spontaneously increase if things could happen without causes. Well, no, I mean, if you follow Prior, that's not what would happen. The electric field is constrained by the nature of the electric field, just as an agent libertarian free will is constrained by the nature of that agent.
Are we going now? It feels like we're talking about Loke. So we can talk a bit about this and then move on to David Liu as well.
Yeah.
Let me just pull up a bit of Loke here a second. Let me just find. He has two books on the Kalam, one in 2017 and one in 2022, I think. And I think what we're talking about now mainly comes in the 2017 book, which is
I think that sounds right. Yeah. Well, there's also a paper.
Origins.
There's also a paper he published in Religions.
Right. Okay. I've got this here now, so I will endeavour to share my screen. This is where I accidentally end the live stream or some shit like that. Right. And what I'll try and also do is get us in. Okay, I think it's done it in a decent way. Okay, cool. So you can see this is chapter 5, which is about this stuff. Did the initial state of reality begin to exist uncaused? I'm just skip over some of this stuff, like the physics stuff. Get around when he talks. Oh yeah, philosophical doubts concerning the causal principle. This is what I was talking about a little bit last time round, was, well, not the empirical evidence bit, I suppose, but the concept of non-being. That's what I was talking about last time. Here's what we're interested in right now. Why do other states of affairs not begin to exist uncaused? Right. And then here he's quoting Craig and Sinclair. If things really could come into being uncaused out of nothing, and it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything does not come into existence, why do not bicycles and Beethoven and root beer, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so everybody knows this, but he more or less reads this out in his debate. So anyone who's seen Craig debate this will be familiar with that. And so now we've got the modus ponens argument. Well, Craig's version, I suppose. Yeah, if it's possible for something to come into being without a cause at a first moment of time, then it's possible for things to come into being without a cause at later moments of time. Not possible for things to come into being without a cause at a late moment of time. Therefore, it's not possible for something to come into being without a cause at the first moment of time. I actually think this is this Craig 2010 paper is actually responding to Oppy's 2010 paper. So there's a bit of a jumble around here because Loke is saying that Oppy replies to this, but he's just got the order the wrong way around. This is Craig rewording the argument slightly from how Oppy put it in his paper. Whatever, it doesn't really matter, I suppose. And basically, Oppy's idea, I think, is something like one reason to think that like a tiger can't just pop into existence uncaused right now, like in front of you, is that presumably there's stuff in front of you already occupying that space. Like a table might be in front of you, and what happens to the table? It would have to vacate the space that's there, and part of the kind of there's I guess it's there's various things about this that are confusing when you start thinking it through in to make it realistic. But like, what's causing the table to disappear, right? Like, how come the table goes out of existence? It feels like the thing, at least part of the reason why it's going out of existence, is because the tiger is coming into existence, right? But the tiger doesn't exist yet, so it feels like the tiger is sort of exerting some causal influence before it's there on the scene to do that. And anyway, so Oppy's sort of grumbling about this idea that it's real. Blah blah. Okay, so and here's Oppy saying more or less what I was just saying. Pick any tiger-shaped space in the room. In order for the tiger to occupy that space must have the appropriate internal and boundary properties. There are, after all, lots of ways that the boundary and interior of that space could be that are simply inconsistent with the occupation of that space by a tiger. Right? That's like if there was a chair there or something already. And if that's right, then it seems to me that we should allow the coming about of the consistency of the boundary and interior space with the occupation of a tiger is a cause of the coming into existence of the tiger. So he's saying that basically the space that's already there would be a cause of the tiger coming into existence as well. So it's like works in both way around. Like the tiger coming into existence is a cause of whatever's there not existing, and the stuff that's already there is a cause of the tiger coming into existence as well. So this is the sort of discussion that Loke's coming into, and here is where he starts advocating for this like stronger modal claim of it being that it would. So I think, he's saying, look, I want to replace premise A with premise A prime, and right. So he's saying if the initial state of affairs could begin to exist uncaused, then certain states of affairs would begin to exist uncaused at later moments of time. Whereas, as we were saying, Craig was merely saying, then it's possible for things to come in. Right. So he's for some reason strengthening the modality there. It seems to me that, like, just straightforwardly, like it being a stronger claim should mean that it's harder to motivate. Dialectically, it's a strange thing to do. It seems.
That's right. I mean, put it this way: there's a possible world where the universe is just empty for almost all time, and then for say 1 hour in the universe's existence, there's say a chair that exists, and it begins uncaused, and it goes out of existence at the end of that hour. As far as I can tell, what I just described is a possible world, right? At least on some standard accounts of modality, like David Lewis's, that certainly is a possible world. But it seems difficult to understand why Loke wants to say that in a world where the causal principle is false, it would definitely be the case that things would be coming into existence uncaused. And when he says uncaused, again, he means like arbitrary entities springing into existence out of the void. But at any rate, I think we can, move past Loke, because the only point here about that was just a signpost that, Loke makes the stronger modal claim, Craig makes a weaker modal claim, and then once you look at the weaker modal claim, the concern is about the nature of explanation.
Well, before we move on from this, I do want to flag. Well, some of it, like I've said before, I struggle reading Loke because it might be my own flaw or whatever. But I'm going to highlight some of the reasons why I find it difficult to read. So we've got this change from possible to would. But then he doesn't explain it at all. He just then starts talking about the B theory of time, and this is not related. So there's absolutely no commentary whatsoever that goes with this change. Like, why signal it and then just not say anything about why you've done that? It's sort of chaotic. It's badly edited or something. Anyway, so we just have to guess. Just don't know why he's made that change. But then the thing that I found really confusing was he's sort of fixated on this phrase that Oppy used about the interior and boundary conditions or whatever of the space that's occupied by the thing before the tiger pops in, right? Which he sort of calls it this condition Cn. And this is just what I was talking about before. Oppy's sort of grumbling about how it's supposed to be made realistic. So Loke wants to respond to what Oppy was saying, but then this becomes incredibly opaque to me. I just struggle to understand what's going on here at all. To address Oppy's suggestion, first consider a certain entity or state of affairs A, right? An entity and a state of affairs are not the same type of thing. They're ontologically distinct types of things, right? States of affairs are like facts or like true propositions or whatnot. They have like an internal structure and they're basically truth apt, or they describe situations. Like an entity is an object. It's a bearer of properties. They're different. So it's clumsy or confusing, at the very least, confuses me to think that we should just roll them together right now. Like, clearly the discussion up to this point has been about not that the word entity is completely rigorous, but like, we're talking about tigers and root beer and Beethoven. They're not states of affairs. They're things, they're objects or entities. So it's weird to start saying or state of affairs. Now, look, if that was the only thing, just rolled it in once there and then it dropped out, fine. I'd be a bit, pedantic or something to complain about that. But it seems to me that the rest of this is entirely, in fact, about states of affairs and not about entities. So he's really just changing subject. And let me just back that up, right? I'm happy to not talk about this for the rest of the evening, but just very quickly, whilst we're doing it, think about this one state of affairs A. He's going to talk about A, B, and C. He wants to suppose that A is an increasing in strength of a pre-existent electric field. Right, but how the fuck is that supposed to be the same type of example, the same sorts of thing that we were just talking about, of like tigers popping into the room out of nothing, right? Presumably the whole point is that the tiger didn't exist beforehand, whereas what we're talking about, the only sort of closest thing we've got to an entity is the electric field, and he's speculating that does exist.
Yeah, this is why I said it sounds more like what was going on in the early modern period, because so if you look at someone like Hobbes or Edwards, they are thinking that in sort of a more general way, where either you could have new entities coming into existence. So Edwards gives the example of like an angel coming into existence, or you could have an entity that pre-exists but coming to have a new property, and then the property that it has begins to exist. And Edwards and Hobbes, for whatever reason, think that these are the same thing. That if an entity could come to have a new property without a cause, then this would also mean that, for example, entities in general could come to exist without a cause. And that's the place where Pryor says, no, hold on, those are not the same thing. If it's true that something can come to have a new property without a cause, that doesn't mean that new substances could begin to exist without causes. And so really we should distinguish these things apart. So if we think that Pryor had the right story about this, then when it comes to the electric field, we should say that no new entity is coming to exist because the electric field is not beginning to exist. But if we're Hobbes or Edwards, then they would want to say that what begins to exist there is not the electric field, but rather the increasing of its intensity begins to exist.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but I think that that's actually too generous and charitable a rereading of what Loke's doing here, because he doesn't talk about properties at all. This whole bit here is about states of affairs. So he actually talks about the state of affairs of the increasing in strength of an electric field as beginning to exist. But like, if my banana is green and then it goes yellow because it becomes ripe, I guess in a sense a new state of affairs has begun to exist, right? Anytime a change happens, a new state of affairs has begun to exist. I guess that's one way you could talk about that. But those types of beginnings to exist are, tangentially related to the types of things we were talking about before, like tigers beginning to exist, or even tigers taking on a new property. Because you could argue that the property is a thing; it's begun to exist. It's kind of categorically different to the object that the property belongs to. But a state of affairs seems to me a third type of categorically distinct sort of type or whatever. So in terms of metaphysics, it's helpful to just sort of like at least stick to one thing at a time, or like be very careful with how we're talking about this. And I just find that, like, unfortunately, this whole discussion that goes on here, and it's page after page after page of this sort of stuff here, where he's saying, well, maybe Oppy could say this, and maybe in which case I would say this, and then maybe Oppy could say this other thing afterwards, in which case I would say this. But I just think, I don't know why we're talking about states of affairs beginning to exist. That's just that's changing subject, too much changing subject.
Yeah.
And actually, I also think that, like, I kind of know why it's happened. What's happened is Loke's trying to think of something beginning to exist that doesn't violate the idea that Oppy was explaining, where, like, well, what if there's already a table in the way, right? What happens to the table? Well, he's thinking, well, maybe there could be something that would begin to exist that didn't involve something having to get out of the way for it to begin to exist. But he's talked himself, his sort of riddle of, like, speaking, he's got himself into a position where he's talking about a state of affairs beginning to exist, as if that's a way to produce a counterexample to the claim. It looks like a counterexample to the claim only in the most superficial sense, because actually it's just changing subject and it's talking about something completely different. So in a way, he makes a really big deal and goes on about the modus ponens argument all the time, but I'm just, I'm done after like half a page of reading this stuff, because
modus tollens argument, right?
Modus tollens argument. What did I say? Modus ponens argument. Yeah. So we could come back to that, but I'm quite happy to, in fact, change topic and well, not exactly topic, I suppose, but let me now move over to David Liu's paper, because I guess that's at least a bit more tangible. So
I think that the way to get into this is that we have to talk about the modified causal principle. So remember the dialectic here, right? So Craig says, Craig defends a version of the Kalam cosmological argument beginning in the 1970s. But if you're looking for the premise, it's on the first page.
Is it? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Right. Right there. Wait, that's not the. That's the old.
Yeah, one. Right. The modified one is a little bit further down, is it?
Does he give it? Or do we have to say it out loud? Maybe I have to say it out loud. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think I have to say it out loud. So, I give it in my paper. But anyway, so Craig gives a version of the Kalam argument beginning in the 1970s that involves the premise that if anything begins to exist, then it has a cause. There are various responses to that premise, as we've sort of gestured at, and one reply you could have is, oh, fine, I'm going to say that things maybe can exist without causes in general, but if the universe began to exist, then the universe had a cause. That's the modified causal principle. And you can then join it with the other premise from the Kalam argument that the universe began to exist, and then you have the conclusion that the universe had a cause. So it gets you to the same place as Craig's original Kalam argument, except that now the causal premise with this modification doesn't claim as much. It doesn't claim that things in general have causes when they begin to exist, but only that the universe would have to. And then Liu's defense of that modified causal principle is that it is, I think this is being put up on screen. So he says, well, if...
Sorry, I'm getting this all... it's because I tried to move onto a different screen and it's changed the ratio, so now the scrolling is fucked. Let me try and get back to... does not want to scroll properly. Okay, so I think I have to zoom in.
I mean, if you pull up my paper, the arguments are a bit clearer there.
Yeah, okay, let's just do that. Let's just look at your paper instead.
So I wrote a reply to Lou, which is what Alex is pulling up.
Which I think is this, I think. Is this the right paper?
No, that's not the right one.
That's not the right one, okay.
Yeah.
Balls. Which is, you can forgive the mistake though, given that it looks like this is the other one you were talking about.
Yes, that's the other one I was talking about. I mean, they're both on this topic, but this one's not in reply to Lou specifically. This one is sort of a more general reply to this kind of concern that Craig has.
Okay, now your paper is, the correct
So-
one is called what then?
Let's see. It's called Universe Without a Cause, or Reply to David Liu.
I mean,
I can send it to you.
I assume it's on your,
It's on my Google Scholar.
I think it was on Phil Papers, but it doesn't look like it is.
It's on Phil Papers as well, and it's on the Philosophy of Science archive.
So I've put the wrong one in the argument, in the...
Yeah, that's why I was
so remind
confused
me
about
afterwards.
what you wanted to
Yeah,
chat
that's what I
about.
was saying.
But here, I just put it into the studio chat.
Great.
And I actually can probably send that out to the audience as well.
Oh yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah, here we go.
People really tune into this stream for the slick production values and how all these things work really quickly, really well. Universe Without a Cause, reply to David Liu.
That's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, and so if you scroll down, right there's the modified version of the argument.
Right.
And so it has the modified causal principle, that one. And then if we scroll down a little bit, Liu's argument, there we go. So there's Liu's argument. He has some sub-premises, and I've suppressed them here. I've also suppressed some unfortunate notation that he uses. But the way this argument works is that he's trying to say that we have some evidence that for the modified causal principle, for the principle that if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. And the way that he argues for that is he wants to say that if that principle were false, then we'd most likely live in a universe that had that would be young but would have the appearance of age, which is what he calls an Omphalos universe. And then he says that if the universe is Omphalos, then it's not likely to be cosmogony friendly, by which he means that there would be a low probability that independent measurements of the universe's age would agree. And then he concludes that because the universe is cosmogony friendly, that is to say independent measurements of the universe's age do agree, then the universe, if it began to exist, then it probably has a cause. Now, the way that he sets up this argument is kind of a mess in a way that I go through in my reply to him. So, in some ways, it's kind of a mess. Is that the third premise here isn't doing any work as far as I can tell. The first two premises are supposed to be equivalent to these probability equations, but they're just not equivalent to those. And then in the conclusion, he brings in the restricted version of the likelihood principle, which doesn't appear in any of the premises. And so the argument isn't logically valid, and it needs something more for the conclusion than what he gives in the premises. So it's kind of a mess in that respect. But what I offer to him in my article, before I offer what I take to be my substantive points against him, I try to sort of steelman his argument and make the strongest version of his argument that I can possibly muster up. And so if you know, part of the, so he wants to use these two probability claims. And in order to use those, he's going to have to claim that our background knowledge includes that the universe began to exist. See, the problem is that what he effectively argues is that we have evidence that there was a cause of the universe, but that doesn't get you to the modified causal principle, right? In general, if you have evidence for the consequent of a conditional, that doesn't give you evidence for the conditional. But if you assume that the universe beginning to exist is part of our background knowledge, and you assume that both of these statements are true, both of these likelihood statements and the first two premises are true, then you can derive that we have evidence for the modified causal principle. And so, you know, I wouldn't ordinarily grant that we do know that the universe began to exist, that that's part of our background knowledge. But I say, okay, fine, for the sake of argument, let's suppose that we do know that. If we did have that as part of our background knowledge, then we can use these probability statements to muster up an argument that we have some evidence for the modified causal principle, at least if these claims about probability end up being true. Foreshadowing, okay. They're going to not end up being true either, but...
But so do you restate the argument then below? Should I
yeah, so I don't give like full premises and conclusions, but I do give equations. So if you keep scrolling down, let's see. I think you have to keep scrolling. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, this is where I give. This is really the meat of the argument. So if little b is little b is the that the universe began to exist, and then c is the universe had a cause. So if b, then c is the modified causal principle, and we're working with the relevance theory of evidence. So this is the theory of evidence according to which if a statement raises the probability of some hypothesis, then that statement is a statement of evidence for that hypothesis. And so we want to see is some statement to that effect. Well, he's claiming that we have evidence for capital C. And so what we want is some condition under which having evidence for capital C ends up being evidence for the conditional if B then C. Well, you can expand the probability of B then C in the way that I give here in this line. And now you see that so if capital B, that's our background knowledge, entails little b, then the probability of not little b given big B is 0. Right? So two parts of the equation on the right-hand side there are going to be 0. And then you get that the probability of the modified causal principle is just equal to the probability of C given B. And if that's true, then if you have some statement that raises the probability of C, it should also raise the probability of the modified causal principle.
Okay, so I feel like what you've probably done there is lose most of the audience. Let's try and unpack that without the reading of notation and letters and such. So does it even matter too much? This is just a way you're trying to say that this is a way that you could justify the premise, right? Which is this.
Well, justify the conclusion. Right. I mean, so Lewis shows up with an argument that's not correctly stated, and I'm trying to restate the argument he wants to give in as strong a form as I possibly can. Yeah. And what we need is some situation in which having evidence for the cause of the universe would be evidence for the conditional claim if the universe began to exist and the universe has a cause. And so you follow through all your probability equations, and what you come up with is that if you include that the universe began to exist as part of our background knowledge, then those two statements that he makes of probability are going to entail that we do have evidence for the modified causal principle.
Yeah, right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's just because the beginning of the universe is included in this big B background knowledge here.
Yeah.
That then the conditional, if the universe began to exist and it had a cause, the probability of that conditional, given our background knowledge, is just equal to the probability of the consequent of the conditional, given our background knowledge.
That's
Because little b is in the background knowledge. So it just it almost trivializes the introduction of it as a conditional. It's just right, because the same thing is included in the background knowledge as in the antecedent of the conditional.
I mean, for Lou's
argument,
argument,
in probability. Right?
yeah. So what this tells us is that for Lou's argument to succeed, I have to already have conceded a whole lot to him that I wouldn't, under other circumstances, concede. Right. So I'd have to concede that we know that the universe began to exist, and what I ordinarily say, the position that I defend in all kinds of places, is that we don't know whether the universe began to exist, and so I wouldn't put that in our background knowledge.
Right, but then he was sort of the somewhat like mouthful of a premise when he was just giving it in normal language, was given that the universe began to exist, then if the universe does not have a cause, there's an extremely low blah blah blah.
Yeah, so the problem here is that, so you can see where he went wrong with this premise. So the reason why this premise is not the same thing, it's not equivalent to the probability claim that he makes, is that he thinks that if you have that the probability of a conditional, say if you have the conditional of A then B, he thinks that that's equal to the probability of B given A, and that's just not correct in general. So he gives this conditional probability statement, but he wants to represent this conditional premise, and that's just not, those are not equivalent.
Yeah, right. This is a sort of strange mistake to be present in an article that's gone through peer review, because you can imagine this sort of technical mistake would have been weaseled out by the reviewers. And
I agree.
His paper was published in Faith and Philosophy, is that right?
That's right.
Which you think would have competent reviewing, but okay, so whatever, sometimes this happens. I might very briefly move back over to his paper just because he discusses his defense of each of the premises.
Yeah.
Is that reasonable? I mean, what we've done is sort of reconstruct the argument, but they're still the same premises. Is that right?
Yeah. So now the job is to figure out, okay, why would cosmogony friendliness give us evidence that the universe had a cause? And that's an argument that's going to have sort of two stages. So first, he wants to argue that if the modified causal principle wasn't true, if the universe didn't have a cause, but nonetheless begin to exist, then the universe would most likely be Omphalos. And this is a term that comes from 19th century discussions of science and religion. It's a Greek term for belly button. The idea here is that the universe would be young, but would have the appearance of age. And the reason why people name that after the Greek term for belly button is because suppose that Adam was created in the Garden of Eden with a belly button. Well, then that means that his body contains evidence of a non-existent past, right? It contains evidence of some gestation in a womb that never happened. Likewise, an Omphalos universe is a universe that is young but appears old. And then he says, okay, if the universe is Omphalos, then independent measurements of the universe's age wouldn't agree with one another.
Right. Or it would be unlikely that they would.
Yeah.
Right.
And then from there he wants to say, oh, well, independent measurements of the universe's age do agree, and so therefore the MCP, the modified causal principle, must be true.
Yeah.
Now so that's the way the argument is supposed to work. I guess we can add, you might wonder, like, well, if the universe began without a cause, why would we think that it would be young with the appearance of age? Liu's defense of that idea is that so as the universe ages, the entropy of the universe increases, and what this means is that the number of microstates that are consistent with the universe's macro state increases. And that means that there are a very large number of microstates of more recent universes that would be consistent with the observed macro state. Or at least that's what he should be saying. I mean, again, this is a place where it's like, well, if you take literally what he says, then the argument's not going to work. But what he intends, I think he has to intend something like this, because he brings up entropy and these kinds of considerations, but the way that he phrases it isn't quite right. And then he thinks.
It sounds to me like, sorry, I think you've jumped ahead a little bit, because I think you're talking about page 1.3 here, are you not? Which is if every possible universe state has an equal probability of beginning to exist uncaused, then there's an extremely high probability that the universe we live in is an Omphalos universe that began to exist uncaused. And then we've got a couple of premises to go through before we get there.
Yeah, fair enough.
Just to make it sort of more structured then. So like, this premise 1.1, given that the universe began to exist if the universe does not have a cause, then any possible universe state can begin to exist uncaused. This is the first of his claims, and he offers some defense of this. So this is what I wanted to let's just look at this quickly to begin with. So what exactly? So I think this is the premise that seemed to me was the one that stood out as most obviously seeming wrong. And I just wanted to jump on the bit that stood out to me earlier. He's just sort of summarizing other views. I thought there was a bit where he says something like, I want the reader to picture with me the history of the universe or something. There was some phrase there, because this is still all the defense of... Alright, maybe I'm not going to be able to scroll immediately onto that very same bit. But, do you recall...
Well, so this is where so what he wants to say is that there's a uniform distribution over the collection of states the universe could have had.
Yeah.
And then, given that uniform distribution, there are many more recent states than there are old ones. That's running the first three premises again together, but I don't know how important it is to like pull those apart. I mean, I guess you wanted to say that I think you wanted to object to the idea that there should be a uniform distribution there in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's right. So this is coming back to me now. So his idea is that, and you see this in Craig, and I guess you see this in Pryor as well, but also Loke, and indeed this paper by Miska that he's quoting here. And the key idea is something like there's nothing about nothing that could make it discriminate, right? or constrained in some way or other. So that it's like, if you want to, so I think what they're trying to say is, look, if you're trying to say, well, maybe the only thing that could begin to exist out of nothing is like the Big Bang or whatever, some initial state of the universe, but not some midpoint in the universe with everything arranged looking like it's old, right? Then if you want to say that one of those is possible, the traditional Big Bang first moment, but everything with like stuff sort of looking like it's old and in flight or whatever, that second thing isn't possible, then what you'd have to do is appeal to some property that nothingness had, which made it discriminate between those two, and such that nothingness gives birth to Big Bangs, but it doesn't give birth to universes that look like they're old, even though they're not. And so I think that's like one of the key ideas here, is supposed to be undermining the thought that there could be any reason to favour something being possible to come out of nothing,
Right.
over others, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a different place where I reply to that kind of idea in my paper in response to Lou. But what I point out is that there are, in fact, other reasons to think that the initial state of the universe could be constrained, and that it couldn't just be any state in the universe's history.
Sure. Yeah, right. But they at least have this idea, I guess, before like immediately going to sort of cut it down. Just wanted to try and make the idea clear that they have. So I think here, the color of the walls of my house are white because I painted them white. But if my house began to exist uncaused, there seems to be nothing to constrain the colors of the walls to be white. Like he's thinking it could just as easily be, if my house popped into existence out of nothing, it could just as easily have yellow walls as white walls or something, right? There's nothing about nothing that could make it pick one over the other. I just wanted to try and like make it intuitive for people listening so that they can understand where Lou's coming from.
Right. I mean, it's again this idea that I talked about earlier, that people in this literature, for whatever reason, have in mind that if there's not a cause that constrains what begins to exist, then nothing at all could do that constraining work. So anything could begin to exist, and nothing would constrain the universe's initial state to be the one that the universe actually began with. And then he thinks that this means that the universe could have begun with any state in its history.
Yeah, right. Yeah, although I think that was the thing that was annoying me about this earlier. I was trying to explain to you before we started, was that like I think he has in mind like the 13.8 billion year history of the universe.
Yeah.
And that you could kind of time slice this. I know it's not relativistic, but you can imagine just cutting like sort of slices out of this block, and you could pick any of them theoretically to be the one that's the first one, because it would just like if this one like from 5 minutes ago was the first one, it would just look like it was older, but it wasn't. Maybe that's the first one instead. And how could you distinguish them? Like nothingness doesn't have any ability to distinguish between those two. And I guess I was just sort of confused thinking about that, which was that like because those, like if you pick any of those, they're going to look quite a lot like they come from a universe that began to exist with a cause, or at least it looks like it came from a sort of Big Bang universe where everything goes back to a sort of hot dense point or whatever. But why are those the only things that are in the domain of quantification? Like, what if the universe could have any state as its first one? Why doesn't it just have a kind of chaotic one that doesn't look like it's old?
In my article on this, there's a very similar concern that I raise. So it turns out that there are relativistic spacetimes that can be sliced up like that, but not all of them can be. And so now the concern is like, okay, well, why are we only concerned with those as opposed to all of the relativistic spacetimes that you could have? And so one way to put a uniform distribution over some collection of possible observations is this principle called the principle of indifference, which says that if there's if there's like symmetry between different possible outcomes, then they should have the same probability. And it turns out that that sort of principle leads to inconsistencies or contradictions. And so the principle of indifference is probably not true, but there's people have modifications of it. And Liu offers the what Robin Collins calls the restricted principle of indifference, according to which you take the relevant theory in physics, and then you take some set of variables that's natural in that theory, and then you're supposed to put a uniform distribution over the possible values of those variables. But now that, if we're interested in doing cosmology, the relevant branch of physics is general relativity. General relativity doesn't just have these spacetimes that can be chopped up in the way that Liu wants, and so now it looks like we're not going to be able to get Liu's argument off the ground, because, as you would put it, there are more things that should be in our domain of quantification than just the states that Liu wants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there would be ones where you would say something like, so I think then you'd almost have a modus tollens argument in reply, which would be something like, if any possible universe, if the universe could begin uncaused, then it could have any possible universe state or something. But just the fact is, if you look around, you don't see any old possible universe state. To put the argument exactly mirroring his, it would be something like, given that the universe began to exist uncaused, it would be highly unlikely that the universe state that you're looking at would be cosmogony friendly. But the universe state that you're looking at right now, look around you, there's cosmic microwave background radiation and like redshifting and blah, 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 whatever. It looks like the type of thing where you can tell how old it is. But like if you just pick a possible universe state at random, it would just be like noise. It wouldn't be the type of thing you'd imagine that like only a tiny fraction of those would be the sorts of highly ordered cosmogony friendly ones that we actually encounter.
It'd be worse than that, because the question here is like, what do we mean by a universe state? Liu is imagining that we have one of these general relativistic spacetimes that can be neatly chopped up into something analogous to instants of time. But general relativistic spacetimes are a much larger family of things than that, and so it looks like if you pick one sort of arbitrarily out of the full mess of possibilities, then you're not going to have universe states at all in Liu's sense, right? I mean, so here's a way that maybe to break this idea down for the audience. Like a relativistic spacetime is something like a loaf of bread, and you can chop that loaf of bread up, into slices as you normally would with a loaf of bread, and then you can think of each of those slices as something like a moment of time. But there are other kinds of bread that we can play around with, like a bagel or a pretzel. Or there's even this stuff called fugazi that if anyone's familiar with that, what that looks like, it's this very complicated thing where you've got a bunch of loops. It's kind of cool looking if you look it up on Google Images. And now, faced with a piece of bread like that, you ask, okay, what is the best way to slice this thing? And there's not an obvious answer. And so with respect to general relativistic spacetimes in general, there isn't like a nice way to slice them into something like something analogous to instants of time. And since these states of the universe that Liu's imagining just are these things that are analogous to instants of time, it looks like, in general, there aren't going to be such things at all that you can define. You could try this. You could say, okay, well, let's. Often in cosmology, we assume that the universe is spatially homogeneous and isotropic. So it means that on these, if you've got that loaf of bread and you slice it, then on each one of those slices, things look basically the same no matter where you are and no matter which direction you look. Under those two assumptions, then the more general equations that you have in general relativity, what are called the Einstein field equations, become the Lemaitre, Friedman, Robertson, Walker, the FLRW equations. These much simpler set of equations, and in that case, you can chop all of those kinds of spacetimes into these things that are analogous to moments or to instants. And so if you thought that was the appropriate place to go, then maybe Lou can get some more traction. But actually, once you do that, there's another problem that looms for him, which is that, okay, take all of the FLRW spacetimes that are thought to have a beginning, right? So this is going to be the singular FLRW spacetimes. These are all of the classic models of the Big Bang. In that case, there's no, as it were, first slice. There's no instant that gets to be the first instant in the universe's history. That's because those models are rather like, so there's this familiar fact from thinking about, say, real numbers, that if you're just concerned with the positive real numbers, so all the real numbers that are greater than 0 and not including 0, then there's no first number, right? There's a boundary, but it's an open boundary, because it doesn't have that first element. And likewise, that's what the Big Bang is like in these models. So there's no first instant. What that means is that when Lou is talking about the possible initial state of the universe, and imagining that it would be one of these slices, well, there just is no such thing if we're thinking about the Big Bang, right? So he's excluded from consideration the models in which he would tend to think that there is a beginning.
I mean, he does give a definition of begin to exist. I think he uses Loke's definition somewhere. Did I dream that? Pretty boring dream if I had that as a dream.
Well,
Sure he does.
So what I'm picking up on here in particular is that he gives a definition for initial state of the universe. And there's a footnote that ends up being really important. Okay, there you go. So begins
to exist. Right. Something has a beginning if and only if it has a temporal extension. The extension is finite in the early direction, and its temporal edges and boundaries, that is, doesn't have a static closed loop or a changeless timeless phase that avoids an edge. So does that allow these, what was it, LFRW?
Yeah, so the FLRW models, they would have, at least the ones that are singular, would have a beginning in roughly that sense. I mean, at least if you have to add some extra ingredients, and you have to add in a direction of time, for example, because they don't come equipped with that. But if you add in some B relations, some relations of earlier than and later than, then sure. But so there's another place in this article where he talks about these states of the universe and what the states of the universe would be in a theory like general relativity. Let's see. See if I can find that.
Yeah, I mean, should we be moving on to this premise 1.2 now? We've sort of talked about it first.
So on page 251.
251, okay, good. Which is premise 1.2.
He says, when we say that the universe began to exist, we are saying that the universe has an initial state. This denotes that there's a smallest indivisible unit of time, i.e. a moment, which can be used to objectively divide up the possibility space into individual states. Given this, the natural variable in our case will be the state of the universe at a particular moment of time, as described by the relevant area of physics.
Right.
And that, if that's what we're thinking about, then that wouldn't that wouldn't capture the Big Bang. So we remove from consideration the Big Bang singularity.
Okay, right. So this is this is him trying to say, well, we're going to use Collins's modified or restricted version of the principle of indifference, which is that we have some natural variable. Yeah, because in Collins's case, I thought that the idea there was that, like, with the fine tuning argument, you might say something like, well, I mean, you pick one of these variables like gravity or something. Well, it's got an infinite range of possible values that it could take, right? Maybe the strength of the graviton could be, any natural number or something. And in which case, it makes the probability distributions like break down, because then you've got to somehow quantify over all of the infinite possible. You've got to distribute your finite probability over an infinite number of different states that it could occupy or something. And what he wants to do is say, well, when it comes to physics, we don't do that. We're sort of zeroing in on a smaller range of what you might otherwise think of as the possible states that the
so there's
could take, right?
Right. So there's sort of two problems that might move you to formulate a new version of the principle indifference. One of them is this normalization concern, but the other one is a concern about whether you can have consistent probability assignments. And so, there are these examples where you can describe a situation two different ways, and when you describe it the two different ways, it gives you different probability assignments as per like the naive principle indifference, and then that leads to a contradiction. And the restricted principle indifference, the work that it's supposed to be doing for Lou is that it's supposed to be avoiding the problems beset by the naive principle indifference, so that we only have like one probability assignment instead of like the multiple that might be possible depending upon how you describe some situation.
Okay, good. So I think what we can say is that so far, at least if I'm tracking what's going on with this, is that for the first premise, we have this worry that it seems like he's restricting his attention down to a set of space-time possible states or something, which seems quite arbitrary. And really, if we're just thinking about all of the time slices that you might have from general relativity that could sort of, in theory, be the first one, then most of them wouldn't look like the ones that we see right here. And then the modus tollens then would just be, well, it just looks like that's just reason to think.
A little bit worse, right? Because it's like with all the different spacetimes that general relativity allows, there's a whole pile of them that don't allow time slicing of any kind.
Yeah.
So it's like it's pretty bad, right? Because now we have to we can't just take our theory of physics and then take the natural variables from that theory. We have to somehow have some further restriction on that theory to even get what Lou was saying to make any sense.
Right, and then his idea of how to restrict that down so that we don't run into that problem is that we would do the.
He doesn't offer a way to do that. What I do in my paper is I offer for him a way to do that, and then when you do consider that way of doing it, you run into a conflict with what he wants to call a beginning, like what he wants to call an initial state, right? Because he has this idea that there would be an initial time slice.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, actually, in a singular model, you wouldn't have an initial time slice.
Right. So, but isn't that what's going on here with this Collins restricted principle of indifferences? Is him saying, well, I will restrict the principle of indifference by referring to this initial state of the universe, but then doing that just means, well, now that sort of comfortable, simple set of models that you would use from general relativity, where you can cut it up into the slices of bread, well, they just don't longer apply anyway because you don't have an initial state of the universe. So we've got problems kind of compounding as we move through this argument. So is that fair? Can we move on to premise 1.3 then? So
Yes.
now he's saying if every possible universe state had an equal probability of beginning to exist uncaused. So we're just assuming things that we've already given good reasons to think it's not going to work here. But then he says, then there's an extremely high probability that we live in an Omphalos universe that began to exist uncaused. So again, that just means a universe that looks like it's old, even though it's not old. So do you have anything in particular that you wanted to bring up in relation to this premise?
So no, I mean, this is the premise that he needs to motivate based upon the universe's entropy. There's some technical reasons why one might not think that this sort of argument would go through, but I think there's a bigger argument coming.
Okay. So we can skip over this.
Yeah, I think so.
To 5.1, is that right then? Why we live in a...
Well, right, I mean, this is
universe?
part of the same premise.
This is part of the same premise, is it? Confused why the numbering that's in this paper, but okay, fine. So we see, it's about time that we see the Roger Penrose number. That always comes up in these discussions, doesn't it? Yeah, here we go, it's this number, isn't it? 1 in 10 to the 10 to the
123, yeah. So here, so 1.4 is where I wanted to get to, because I think this is...
If anyone's got this number on their bingo card, you know.
Yeah, well, you know what's funny about that number too is, so there's so many people who think that that's like fine-tuning for life, and actually Penrose meant that number as an objection to the idea that the universe was fine-tuned for life. So it gets interpreted in precisely the opposite way as what Penrose intended. But anyway, this premise 1.4 is really important, right? This is the one that's going to be doing like all of the work for him. That if there's an extremely high probability to live in an Omphalos universe that began to exist uncaused, then there's an extremely low probability that the universe is cosmogony friendly. And that is definitely not true. And I can very easily show you that it's not true. So an Omphalos universe is one that's young but has the appearance of age. And by the appearance of age, Lu means one where independent measurements of the universe's age agree with one another. And then, okay, what does it mean to be cosmogony friendly? Well, cosmogony friendly means that independent measurements of the universe's age agree with one another. In other words, being Omphalos entails being cosmogony friendly. So there's this premise cannot be true.
That's right, because being Omphalos just means, as you were talking about before, it's like the belly button thing. I mean, that just is a way of being able to determine that you're old or whatever. There's no... So this is just like a blunder, surely. This is like, you don't even need any physics at this point. It's just, this term means this thing, this other term means this thing, the same thing.
Right.
So that means they have to both be true at the same time. You know, it can't be that one's true and the other one's false. Yeah. When I read that the first time in your paper, I had to sort of do a double take and then go back to his paper to be like, really, can it be that simple and straightforward? But yeah, I think you're absolutely right there.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, you know, so I haven't mentioned this, but the way that I first came across this paper is that there's a radio program called Unbelievable, and they asked me to do a conversation with David Liu. And so, you know, I ended up doing that, and then I wrote up this paper in reply to him after thinking about his paper for that conversation. And, you know, this would have been a great point to bring up on air, but I didn't think of it. You know, it took me a long time to realize that, no, actually, his article has this, like, really central problem that's as simple as this is. Like, we don't have to bring up a whole bunch of the kinds of technical considerations that I brought up in that episode. It actually just fails for this very simple reason. And you know, in my article in reply to him, I offer two possible ways that he could go from here, because he might try to fix his argument up in some way. I mean, you could say, well, maybe what he wants to say is that without a cause of the universe, we would most likely live in an Omphalos universe. And then it's not that it wouldn't be cosmogony friendly, it would be cosmogony friendly, but we'd be stuck in this skeptical scenario that would be completely intolerable. And so we'd want to avoid that skeptical scenario. The other possibility is where we say, okay, without a cause of the universe is most likely young, and most young universes, most ways that the universe could be young, it wouldn't be cosmogony friendly, and so wouldn't be Omphalos either. And then the fact that the universe is cosmogony friendly, and therefore most likely isn't young, would give us reason to think that the universe had a cause, right? So those are two possible ways that he could proceed from here. And I don't know which one you want to pursue, but they're both live options at that point.
I think the first one of those is that Miska paper that was quoted at the beginning of this, which is about it just being a skeptical issue at that point. It's kind of an epistemological worry is on the horizon if you allow that hypothesis that the universe is young.
Yeah, and that one has a very simple reply. So the reply that I give in my paper is just to say, well, the hypothesis under consideration, the one we want to evaluate, is that the universe had a cause, not the hypothesis that the universe was caused by God. Right. So the universe being caused is equivalent to some big disjunction, namely all the different ways the universe could be caused. One of those is that's caused to exist by God. And we could suppose that maybe God would have a reason to make a cosmogony-friendly universe. But that's not what we're considering. We're not considering that disjunct, we're considering the big disjunction. And if you, even if it's some evidence for that particular disjunct, that doesn't mean that it's evidence for the big disjunction. I mean, importantly, if the universe is caused to exist, and you're considering all the different ways that it could be caused, well, it could be caused, all those different Omphalos universes, insofar as each one is possible, could be caused to exist. So, at that level of causation doesn't give you any advantage. It doesn't, saying that the universe was caused doesn't tell you that it would have been cosmogony friendly, even if there's a particular disjunct where that would be so.
Yeah, right. Like, I was thinking this when I was reading this as well, that, I mean, I guess he does try and go on to address this a little bit, but why couldn't God have caused... I mean, God makes Adam just sort of begin to exist with the appearance of age, right? It's the whole point of this term, where it has a belly button or whatever. So, like, God could have made the universe begin to exist 5 minutes ago with me, with all my memories, and us thinking that we've been having a conversation.
That's
he could
right.
have just made that happen. So, how do you know, like, how does he even tell between the hypotheses of, like, uncaused creation ex nihilo and
the defense that
uncaused origination and creation ex nihilo? Like, what's the difference between these two?
So the defense that Lou offers in his paper is to say that that God would have a reason to create a cosmogony-friendly universe.
Yes,
and one that's not only cosmogony-friendly, but it is really old and so on, that, like, for our senses to be veridical and so on. But
God wouldn't do that, is basically his argument.
Right. But even if we suppose that that's true, the hypothesis being considered here is not that God caused the universe to exist. Instead,
yes, right.
The hypothesis is that the universe was caused. And for that hypothesis, you don't gain anything by pointing out that there's some particular hypothesis about it being caused that would have this consequence.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that he wouldn't want to go down the skeptical version that we just offered, two continuations of it there. I think what's going on is that he even says thanks to a referee for pointing out this term Omphalos to me, presuming that an earlier version of the paper didn't actually use that term.
Yeah, and I wonder what the paper looked like before that. Maybe they were, like, very badly misled by a reviewer or something.
Right, but I think that the point would just be that what it does is rolls together the idea of being young and looking old, and they don't actually have to be rolled together. He's just trying to say that, like, if the universe was young, then it's unlikely that it would look old, right? And then he's got himself into this silly blunder here of premise 1.4 being, if it's an extremely high probability that, basically, so this premise says if there's an extremely high probability that P, then there's an extremely low probability that P, because he's using the terms. Those two terms basically just mean the same thing. But what he just actually means is that if there's an extremely high probability that the universe is young, then there's an extremely low probability that it looks like it's old. That is what he's trying to say. So I think that exactly was the second horn that you were offering him. That you could go down this other route instead of just not using Omphalos and getting confused about that, but just keeping clear those two aspects to it. But Omphalos meaning is young but looks old, and as long as you keep those two things apart, then you don't run into that issue of saying the same thing twice. And
that's right.
A high probability and a low probability to the same thing.
But then you run into this other problem that the having evidence for disjunct doesn't give you evidence for the big disjunction. And it's weird that one of the things that was sort of that I felt was strange when I first read this paper was that he doesn't engage with a long-standing issue in the philosophy of physics literature that's very closely related to this entire discussion. So there's something that's very important that happened with the discovery of general relativity, and it has to do with precisely what it was that made people first begin talking about the possibility of thinking about the beginning of the universe from a scientific perspective. Right? And if you look back at the medieval period, people had various arguments that the universe had a beginning, but none of those arguments involved like going from completely rational or empirical concerns to the conclusion that the universe began at such and such point in the past. Right? Some of those arguments were like, oh, well, infinity has these weird features, so the past couldn't be infinite. Or they said, like certain kinds of causal series have these problems, so those couldn't be infinite. What happens with general relativity is that for the first time, people start saying, oh, we can actually detect the universe's beginning. And they start saying that because they make the following assumption. They say, space-time, we're going to assume, is as large as space-time could possibly be.
Okay,
and then it turns out that there are some space-times that run up against the boundary, and you can't continue them past that. The geometry of the space-time forbids any further extension. So in singular space-times, this is what happens at the singularity, that the space-time just cannot be extended past, say, the Big Bang singularity, because the geometry of space-time itself prevents that. So there's then this very important relationship that what's called the maximal extendability of space-time has to the idea of a singularity, that in order to avoid precisely this kind of skeptical concern that the universe would have some like arbitrary boundary that you couldn't detect, instead we're going to say, no, space-time is always going to continue as far as it possibly can. And it's only when the geometry prevents you from extending it that we're going to say that it has a boundary. There's other possibility where space-time has an arbitrary boundary, one that's not forced on you by the geometry. That's called a truncated space-time. And the standard sort of idea is that if you have a truncated space-time, then that introduces a skeptical problem, right? If the universe could have begun last Thursday, but everything else would be exactly the same. So the universe, so in other words, take space-time as it is and just truncate it at last Thursday, draw an arbitrary boundary there. Well, then you have this huge skeptical problem because all of us have memories of non-existent events that happened before Thursday. And so the standard sort of idea is that truncated spacetimes lead you to inappropriate kinds of skepticism. And so you're going to have some thesis about space-time being as large as it could possibly be. This is very closely related to concerns that actually go back before general relativity. So if folks know their history of philosophy, this is very close to a concern that was central to the Leibniz-Clark correspondence. So the Leibniz is replying to Clark and Newton, who believe in absolute time. And in this picture of absolute time, the idea is going to be that time extends beyond what they want to call the universe, and then God has to pick out a time to create the universe. And the idea is that, well, if you just have empty time, in other words, use of time, and there's no other objects around, then nothing distinguishes any time from any other, and so any choice that God makes is completely arbitrary. Likewise, there's a similar concern here, that if you truncate space-time at, say, last Thursday, then there's just you're violating the principle of sufficient reason to do that. And so people attracted to the principle of sufficient reason are going to say that, well, maybe space-time just always extends until there's some sufficient reason for it to be truncated. If you think that that's like a metaphysically necessary principle, or you think it's a consequence of physical law, or you think that there's like some other reason why space-time should be maximally extended, then regardless of whether the universe had a cause, it's not going to be Omphalos. By the way, this thesis about it being maximally extended solves epistemic problems that Liu's hypothesis cannot solve. Right? Because the skeptical problem isn't just that the universe could have started last Thursday with memories of a non-existent past. It's also that the universe could have a boundary 3 feet to my left. And then when I look over to my left, I'm seeing objects that don't actually exist there, right? Light is being created at the boundary of the universe and meeting up with my eyes to show me a non-existent part of my office. That's a skeptical hypothesis, just like the one that we consider when we think about Omphalos universes. But the universe having a cause doesn't even attempt to solve that problem. Mm-hmm. And so or you can think about a kind of counter-inductive concern where you say, hey, maybe the universe could arbitrarily end tomorrow. Well, we don't think that it's going to. And our assumption that it's not going to is really just the assumption that we're going to, that if you're modeling space-time, you ought to continue space-time through tomorrow and beyond. That it's not just going to be arbitrarily truncated at tomorrow or in some other arbitrary place. And you sometimes see people in philosophy of religion who raise similar ideas, even though they maybe don't know the physics literature. So there's this nice passage from Joshua Rasmussen where he says, hey, like, wouldn't it be weird if if space-time were in the shape of a giraffe? And it's like, well, yeah, it would be weird. And why is it weird? Because that's like an arbitrary way of truncating space-time, right? So like your intuition that it shouldn't be truncated in the shape of giraffe without an explanation is really just the intuition that it should continue beyond those boundaries unless there's some reason to invoke them.
Yeah, okay, good. So this is the principle of the maximally extended universe.
Yeah.
And that it's like a independently motivated principle anyway, coming from the philosophy of physics. It solves more skeptical issues than even if we agreed with Liu that you have to accept the modified causal principle to get around the worry that he was trying to drum up. Even if you gave him absolutely everything he wanted there,
right,
there'd still be these other versions of the problem, like the not having the illusion of age, but having the illusion of depth or whatever, and it doesn't help you with that in any sense. So the maximally extended universe kind of like pays its way as an assumption, I suppose. In it does a load of useful theoretical work and solves a bunch of like otherwise problems that might be looming on the horizon. But if you go along that line, you just don't need to suppose the modified causal principle anymore, because it's kind of just taken care of by supposing that the universe is as big as it could possibly be anyway, because that says also that it's as old as it could possibly be.
That's right. So here's one other important thing to throw in here. The way that I've been talking about it is as if I endorse it, but in fact, I don't even need to say that I think it's true. I don't need to endorse it. All I actually need is that this hypothesis is superior to Liu's hypothesis.
Yeah.
And so long as that's true, his argument can't succeed, right? Because
even if it was the same, then you would end in a draw, and it wouldn't be clear which one of them is true. Or something.
That's right. Yeah. So there are people who are sort of metaphysically allergic, including some philosophers of physics that I have a great deal of respect for, and they would deny the maximal extendability hypothesis, but it doesn't matter. Like, the point is just that this hypothesis is superior to Liu's, and then that, as long as that's true, his argument doesn't get off the ground.
I appreciate that you've got to go and teach in like not a huge amount of time.
Yeah, so we have about 10 more minutes, and I think there's one last argument from my reply to his that we haven't gotten to, and I think we should.
Boltzmann brains.
The Boltzmann brain thing, yeah, that's right.
There's another bingo card thing. Anyone's got Boltzmann brains, they can take a shot now as well.
So I thought of this argument while I was doing my interaction with Liu, sort of live on air on Unbelievable. There's something about the way that the host had put a particular point. They kept being like, well, if you concede these points to Liu, would his argument work? And it was like, well, if I give him everything in the world plus the kitchen sink, fine. But then there's a certain point where I realized that actually, if I concede almost everything to him, we still don't get his argument off the ground. And it's for a very simple reason, that you can't infer that the universe is not Omphalos. In fact, you actually have to presuppose it. And that's for a very simple reason. So if you think about the formation, what happens when you form a record. So think about, for example, these old-fashioned cameras where you put like a photographic plate inside, you open a shutter, and it exposes, and the chemical reaction forms an image on the plate. There's 3 stages to that. There's a ready state where the camera is ready to take an image, but the shutter's not open yet. There's what happens when the chemical reaction's actually going on and the shutter is open. And then there's afterwards when the shutter is closed and now the record is kept. That's a process whereby you have a kind of irreversible chemical transformation in the photographic plate. If all you knew were the laws of physics and the state that you end up in, and you ask, did this most likely come from one of those previous states we talked about, like that ready state where the camera was cocked and so on? The answer to that question is no. So it's a very special state for the camera to be in that ready condition. It's a low entropy state compared to the end state. There are very few ways, comparatively speaking, to arrange the universe where that's true. And in fact, there are more ways, vastly more ways, to arrange the universe so that end state simply fluctuates into existence out of a higher entropy state than having come about from this lower entropy state. Now, the only way that you know that thing began in that lower entropy state is that you have, in turn, a record of that lower entropy state, and you get this regress of ever lower entropy states going back in time. And what's going to ground this whole thing in the first place is going to be the sort of the ready condition for all of physical reality, for the whole universe. What David Albert calls the mother of all ready conditions. This is going to be a state that you don't infer through any normal scientific means, but instead that you presuppose, the thing that you're presupposing is what's called the past hypothesis. It's just the hypothesis that the universe began in a low entropy configuration. And then under that presupposition, you get that the past was as you remember it, that the records that you have are actually veridical. But without that assumption, if you only knew that the state that you presently observe and the laws, then you get the skeptical hypothesis, where in fact what you think is going on at present just sort of fluctuated into existence from some higher entropy state. Now, Liu's considerations about the Omphalos universe are similar. He wants to say something that's very similar to that, but concerning not like your present mental state and the observations that you're making now. Rather, it's going to be about the universe. But we're going to get a very similar consideration that if what he's saying is right, then the most likely way to have a universe is not to have this whole thermodynamic history, but instead a universe that just simply fluctuated into existence a moment ago and has the illusion of a past, because there's going to be many more ways to get a universe like that than there are to get a universe that has this full thermodynamic history. So in fact, the only way to escape the skeptical hypothesis raised by the possibility of an Omphalos universe is not through a scientific inference, but instead through a presupposition about what the history of the universe must have been like. Once you make that presupposition, you're also presupposing that the universe is old. In other words, you're presupposing that it's not Omphalos. And so in other words, an argument that's just utterly bog standard in the philosophical foundations of thermodynamics tells you that you cannot infer whether the universe is Omphalos. You instead must presuppose that it's not Omphalos.
So it's like a wider, more general skeptical issue here. Is skeptical issue the right way of putting it? I guess it is, right? It's just the Boltzmann brain worry is just like a much more general version of what Liu is bringing up in his paper, which is basically a special case of that.
I'm not even sure it's a more general case. I mean, it's very closely related. I mean, the way that so the two skeptical hypotheses the two skeptical scenarios that I consider my paper, I call one the Boltzmann brain, where your like present observations and your brain sort of fluctuate into existence out of some higher entropy soup. The other skeptical hypothesis is one according to which the entire universe came into existence, and it was sort of selected from all of the possible macro states that are consistent with the presently observed macro state.
Right. So that's like a Boltzmann universe.
That's right, a Boltzmann universe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I call it.
Isn't Liu's issue the Omphalos universe is just a narrow subset of the type of worry that the Boltzmann universe hypothesis is presenting you with? And your point is, well, we have to already deal with the Boltzmann universe thing anyway. So whilst we're doing that, we've basically solved by fiat this Omphalos universe worry.
Yeah, in other words, there's a transcendental argument against the possibility of inhabiting an Omphalos universe. And it's a kind of interesting transcendental argument because it has some features that are similar but different from like Kantian transcendental arguments. Because it does have these, it makes use of what we think we know empirically, because it makes use of our scientific knowledge to construct this transcendental argument. But also it's similar to the kind of Kantian arguments because it's talking about like what the preconditions are for the veridicality of our knowledge in the first place. Um, so it has those kinds of peculiar features, but nonetheless, it's an utterly standard argument. Um, and something that I haven't thought about deeply is like, what relationship would this have to other kinds of transcendental arguments? But in any case, the point just is that there is this argument, and it requires us to rule out Omphalos universes by fiat, as you said.
And by transcendental argument here, you mean it in the sort of technical sense it's used in analytic philosophy, not the kind of debate me bro, J. Dye sense, where it's like, there's paradigms, dude, there's paradigms and transcendentals, and yeah.
Right, that's right. I mean, there is, so, I think Van Til probably meant it in a Kantian sense.
Yeah.
Though, who knows what it was that Van Til originally meant. So, in any
Van
case,
Til is a bit like reading Andrew Loke. Sometimes it's very confusing to follow and see what's going on.
yeah, right. But yes, I do mean it in the technical sense, the sense that it's sort of like a
Sorry, I'm just
descendant
making a J.
of
Dye
Kant
joke for no reason.
sense.
Yeah. Listen, thank you so much for coming in here. Do you
Yeah.
you need to basically go? I was going to look at the chat and see if there were any questions. They basically be for you because it's been you talking about this stuff with.
I mean, we could, if you want to save those, I could come back on another time and we could go through the audience questions.
Well, I'm sure we could just talk more about the causal principle. Well, you know what? Why don't we do this again? Maybe next week, where we can try and have a think about. I don't want to. I don't know if I actually can face doing the modus tollens.
Well, as you pointed out, I have this other article, and so there's more stuff on this topic that we could go through.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So why don't we do that? I don't know if you're free next week. We can figure out the details, but
Yeah.
either I'll be back on my own next week doing a bit more, or Dan will be back and we'll continue this. But if you've got any pressing questions right now, if you can kind of tag me in them, or better yet, pay for a super chat, I'll make sure that we can bring them up next time. It's just Dan's got to go. You've got to teach in like 10 minutes. So
Yeah.
it's a bit unfair to keep you talking till like the second before you have to then start talking for another hour. But yeah, okay, great. Thanks very much for coming on.
Yeah.
I'll stay on for a few minutes just to see if there's any funny J. Dye memes that I can engage with or anything. But I'll let you go. So crack on, and we'll
right.
we'll pick it up next time you're on.
All right, I'll see you later.
Thanks, man.
Bye.
Okay, good. Let's have a look at this chat then, see what's going on. I see 99 plus things. What am I doing? Public chat. Cool. All right, having a look through. I was going to say hi to people. Oh, it looks like we've got Richard Carrier in the chat. Looks like we've got Digital Gnosis. Looks like we've got Modern Atheism. Cool. This is and Shasset, who knew the obscure Japanese philosopher from before, which is great. So let me see. Has anyone got anything they want me to look at? I mean, Dan's the expert in this, and he's not here anymore. So maybe this is fucking pointless. But I can't possibly read all of these. Now's your chance if you want me to engage with any chat. Replace bad wire. The fuck does that mean? Is that Dan's audio quality that you're talking about there? Yeah, Richard, I've put in the chat, in the description, the wrong one of Dan's paper. So he has two papers that are quite similar on this. I'll update that so that it's the correct one. I guess next time we'll probably go through the paper that I actually put in the description. Okay, I think I might just go and have some dinner because there's obviously a whole load of chat. It's really nice to see everybody chatting and engaging in the live chat. It's cool. Here's a question. Okay, there are a couple of questions. Do I think the Kalam can work without the A theory? Maybe you could probably modify some of Craig's arguments for the second premise, I guess. Maybe if you just ran with like the Grim Reaper argument instead. I don't think that presupposes the A theory. Craig seems to think that the Kalam presupposes the A theory, but I don't know about that. I think you probably could come up with some version that didn't. I'd still not be persuaded. I don't think it would work, but that's a different question. And then modern atheism, you've said, what about Kuhn's argument that if things can have no causes, then our thoughts can, and are thus unreliable? Yeah, I take it that this is the skeptical version of the argument, which is also Miska's, which we mentioned a couple of times in the stream. So Kuhn's argument in particular, I think, is actually about the principle of sufficient reason rather than the causal principle. But I think that's hardly a distinction worth making. I think there is a skeptical, there's kind of an epistemological version of this stuff we've been talking about tonight, which is about ushering in these skeptical worries, and that is one of the things we'll come on to in a different week. So just let you know, come back in a few weeks and we'll be talking about that directly. So Richard says, could you summarize in a couple of sentences what today's chat might give you that you can use against Craig? Well, I don't know about that. I think I'm going to have to mull over Dan's paper a bit, but I suppose one thing that's useful is the maximally extended universe hypothesis being a kind of alternative to the causal principle, at least when it comes to dealing with this type of worry about, like, well, maybe the universe could just look old or something. There's like, you don't have to appeal to the causal principle in order to avoid this worry. You can appeal to the maximum extended universe hypothesis instead. That's one back pocket thing to have to hand. I'm going to go and read a bit more about that. Go and look at Dan's papers again. So I think that's one helpful thing. Here's another question. Could we make kind of like a Hegelian argument on that nothing is negated by itself, like being thesis is negated by non-being antithesis and negated by non-being? I don't know. Maybe I'm not. Hegel Schmegel, I think, is my response to that type of thing. But sorry, I don't mean to be dismissive. I can't formulate a good idea about what you're asking me there. How many streams do you plan to do for this debate? Well, one a week up until the 2nd of May. So how many is that? Probably about 10. My long-term plan is to just do everything I can. Not necessarily so that I'm like the best debate bro in the universe, but because then I'll write a book. Basically, that's the wider plan. The talking to Craig is really, in a sense, kind of instrumental to the book project, which seems much more significant. I want to do that anyway. So my idea is, if I go through all of this stuff with the Craig debate as a thing in the future, that motivates me to do it. And then by the time I've done it, it'll be easy enough to just sort of write a book on it. That was my thought. But I think it probably at least 10. And maybe I'll just keep doing it. I don't know. Potentially infinitely is a hilarious answer to that question, I suppose. Nathan, do you think that engaging in these first-order disputes will actually be fruitful with Craig? He would just stall and spin and think, yeah, I think you're right, absolutely. Of course, what am I going to do? Make Craig go, oh, I'll eat my hat. 45 years of defending the Kalam, I give up because of this unbelievable debate. No, not really. I don't think that's going to happen. The fruitfulness would be in other people hearing both sides of it, which might be interesting, it might be educational for them. As I said, my wider project is writing a book, so I think that would be helpful. what else? I think it would be cool to meet Craig in person. You know, it's a fun thing to do. You know, it's in a sense it's kind of an honor to be given the invitation to be taken seriously to talk to him. So that's just like a fun day out for me. Being a Berry says, do holes exist? Yes, is my quick answer then. Yeah, but no, that's there's obviously sort of deeper questions about that. I actually started reading a book by Roy Sorensen, Philosophical History of Nothing, which is super fun. Has all these reviews on the back by like McX and people, you know, people who don't exist. One of them just says, "Who even is Roy Sorensen?" It's great. Anyway, fun book, Philosophical History of Nothing by Roy Sorensen. Fun book to read, sort of coffee table book. Nathan, you said I should come up with a different strategy that forces him to deconstruct his methodology. I mean, maybe. That sounds quite ambitious. I think I'll be lucky if I just get through it without looking like a plunker. I got a smaller, less ambitious goal in mind. Okay. Cool. Richard says he will want this book. Well, good. I mean, I hope that some people would want to read it. I think it would be fun to do because there's a couple of books on the Kalam, like, you know, Richard Carrier. Andrew Loke has 2 books on the Kalam. Jacobus Erasmus has a book on the Kalam. Obviously, Craig has a book on the Kalam. They're all defenders of the Kalam. And I don't know that there's any books on the Kalam that are written by people who are not defenders of the Kalam. Like Oppy's got his book on infinity. Sarabji has this like history of philosophy, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, he's not exactly a fan of the Kalam stuff, but yeah, I think there's a gap in the market for someone to write sort of up-to-date book that doesn't just endorse the Kalam, which is that's my pitch that I'm going to give to the publishers. Shas, says, why won't I debate Jay Dyer? And the answer to that is obviously because I'm a cuck and a coward. Have I ever, a couple more of these, have I ever considered that the Kalam falls prey to the uniqueness fallacy? What's the uniqueness fallacy? I'm not sure I can think of what that is off the top of my head. You know what, I've got the internet in front of me, why don't I just Google that? The uniqueness fallacy. Uniqueness effect? False uniqueness effect. Don't think that's the same thing. The uniqueness fallacy. Imagine that you were part of an island community busy building society amongst palm trees and white beaches, lapping gently against it, blah blah blah. Christ, I just want a succinct explanation of what it is. I don't know, I'm not, you're going to have to tell me what it is if I'm going to answer it now. Oh, the Kalam does not imply monotheism or even a single prime mover. I think what you're saying is like, you know, could it be that the universe has a cause, but it's not God, I think. Yeah, here we go. Uniqueness fallacy, asserting that there's only one object that has the properties that you desire. Okay, so it could be that like maybe it is caused to exist by an agent, but it's not the agent that's depicted in the Old Testament or something. Yeah, I think I've kind of put that into like a Kalam stage 2 sort of worry, where you go beyond just establishing that the universe has a cause, and trying to think about, yeah, Nathan, that's the gap problem. Yeah, that's right. I'm not sure I'm even going to look at that here. I figured there was so much just to cover in just the sort of stage 1 bit of the Kalam, where you just establish that universe has a cause, There's enough there with all of the philosophical arguments and stuff. So you might be right, and I think there's the, I think if anything, I think the stage 2 stuff is like worse or whatever than the first lot. If I run out of things to talk about, run out of things to do on stream, I'll start looking at the stage 2 stuff. There's far less on the stage 2 stuff as well. Okay. I mean, not necessarily a question for Alex, but what's the closest anyone here has come to seeing evidence that J. Dyer has any of the degrees he claims to have? Well, all I know about this one is that I asked ChatGPT if the university he went to offered master's degrees in philosophy, and it said that it didn't. And then when I posted about that, he replied saying that he never says that he had a master's degree in philosophy, but that's blatantly a lie. So I think Jay Liar has just lied about that for years. Even if sometimes he's sort of said that he doesn't. He definitely has on occasions deliberately and blatantly lied about that. All right, cool. I need to eat some food. So look, thank you very much for watching. We'll be back next week, probably chatting to Dan again. Send me a message or whatever if you've got any suggestions or things. I guess like and subscribe. Probably should have said that 2 hours ago. Yeah, cool. I'll see you in the next one.